Welcome back, students. We are in video 3 of 4 of Modular 11, Services to Children, Youth, and Families. And we're going to go ahead and move forward and start talking specifically about Child Protective Services, or what's often referred to as CPS. So CPS provides a whole array of different services, often many of them being mandated, which means that they are a requirement for individuals who have been often court ordered that they are required to have to participate in. So these are mandated services provided by state social service agencies, often through contractual relationships with county CPS offices, to families who abuse or neglect their children. The purpose of CPS is to protect children whose safety is seriously endangered by the actions or inactions of their caretakers. All reports must be investigated to determine if abuse or neglect can be substantiated. And all states and counties have a minimum standard of care that's expected by parents or caregivers. And when that minimum standard of care is not achieved by a family member or by a parent, that's when CPS is likely to step in. CPS is most often involuntary, which means that the parents did not necessarily request for CPS to become involved in their family, but they've often been required to participate in their services. So investigations of child maltreatment usually involves coordination with other professionals. An investigation is conducted into the allegations. Let me take a step back. This is kind of like a step-by-step process about the ways that CPS works. So a report is made. An investigation is conducted into the allegations. If abuse or neglect is found, it's determined that what effect it's had on the child. Is it physical? Is it mental? Could it be life-threatening? How severe is it? Should the child immediately be removed from the home? But CPS is always striving to find a balance between their authority and compassion, or between the ability to confront and the ability to be empathetic. It's one of the challenges of being a child protective services worker. So determination of the intervention approach: does the child need to be protected, and what is needed to provide that protection? CPS workers have 4 choices based on their assessment. They could determine that the child is not being maltreated and withdraw from the case. They can offer help to the family. They can determine that the child is at serious risk and that the parents are being uncooperative, and therefore they begin to make arrangements to take the family to court. And with the court's permission, they are able to remove the child from the home immediately and place the child in emergency care, and usually later on into foster care. So CPS workers provide a wide array of services, and again, services to the families, making every effort to ensure that children can be safe in their own homes. They can serve as case managers. They can provide counseling, parent education and support, help parents get into a support group. And as we've spoken before about other social service kind of interventions, there may be the development of a contract between the case manager, the social worker, and the parents or the family that are involved. And again, with each party having responsibilities of things that they need to achieve and complete in order to be able to move the process forward. So a relatively new approach to working with families is what's been identified as family preservation services. So family preservation service programs incorporate a family systems perspective. So again, going back to that systems perspective and the concept of looking at a family as a single unit. So the family systems perspective works with families They are looking at a family that is, again, seen as a unit, but maybe is operating at a level of dysfunction that is not in the best interest of the child or others in the family. Sometimes family preservation services are also known as family intervention programs, but the goal, whatever the name of the program, is to keep the family together by increasing skills and competencies of the family members. Efforts focus on home-based family-centered services. So the family stays in the home, the child stays in the home, and all of the services are delivered in the home. So there's various types of family preservation programs. Most are usually community-based and provide support and education services. Family-centered prevention programs, they provide case management, counseling, education for families with problems that threaten their stability. Intensive family preservation services are designed for families in crisis when removal of the child is imminent or reunification with the family is underway. These programs generally offer crisis intervention, staff members available to provide round the clock services, low caseloads, and highly intensive time limited services. So I think the best way to kind of describe this is that often what you have when you have a social worker who's been assigned to family preservation program is you have a social worker who has a very small caseload, 4 or 5 families maybe that they're working with. The expectation is that they are to be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The idea is that if that family finds themselves in a crisis situation, that the social worker is immediately available. Um, so it's quite an intensive role to be playing in terms of a social worker. But it's been shown for families, particularly families that are in serious crisis, that if you are really striving to be able to keep this family intact and to not feel that you need to remove the child from the home, this type of very intensive service is a strategy that may prove to work in terms of reducing the likelihood that that child will have to be placed out of the home. Then we move on to out of home or substitute care. So this is where it's come down to the fact that the child is going to be removed from the home, and where will the child go from there? So out of home care provided for children, this is when the parents are unwilling or unable to provide care in their own home. Types of substitute care include foster care, group home care, could be psychiatric treatment facilities, it could be residential treatment. It's all based on what the child needs. And once a child is placed in substitute care, the social worker has to develop a plan on the disposition, either to return the child to the home that they were originally in, or to terminate parental rights and place the child in an adoptive family. So under federal law, the court must review the case every 6 months to ensure that the child is not in limbo in the child welfare system. We call this drifting, that a child is sort of drifting through the child welfare system. And that's something that the court is strongly advocating to try to prevent from happening. They expect that there is a plan that's laid out. There's expectations that a social worker will be most likely initially working with the family to try to see if reunification is something that would be possible, and that at a certain point in time, it will have to be determined that reunification is not possible. And if it is not possible, then a plan has to be laid out for substitute care, which again would be either foster care, group home care, psychiatric treatment, residential treatment. So substitute care. If a child does require placement in substitute care, the placement should be the least restrictive option. So again, that goes back to that best interest of the child, least detrimental situation that we talked about earlier in the presentation. So often the first considerations for substitute care will be relatives, neighbors, others with whom the child maybe is already familiar. And if those individuals fail to meet the criteria to be positive substitute parents for the child, consideration is given to finding care that is consistent with the child's cultural background, preferably in the same neighborhood or school area. So, one of the objectives in terms of least detrimental or best interest of the child is, could this child be placed in a home where they would be able to continue to attend the same school that they've attended before? If they have friends in the neighborhood, would they still be able to access those friends? So, again, anything that doesn't result in sort of a drastic or dramatic change in terms of the child's situation is what's considered in the best interest of the child. And it's important to recognize that historically in the past, um, there was sort of less of an evaluation of relatives, meaning that if somebody is going to become a foster parent, there's some very, very specific expectations and requirements that people have to go through in order to be able to be designated as a foster parent. Um, but years ago, if there was a relative that was willing to take the child on, those same considerations were not necessarily always applied to the relatives. And from what I understand, that has changed. And now, even if it's a relative, a grandmother, an aunt, an uncle, whatever, that is going to be the home that this child is going to be placed in uh, as a foster parent, they have to be able to meet the same requirements that a regular foster parent family would have to meet. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I did want to just again outline the various types of substitute care. We've talked about family foster care. This is often somewhat temporary, although you can certainly hear the horror stories from adults who have been part of the foster care program and have just been in foster care for years and been in a whole different series of different foster homes. So this is a form of temporary substitute care in which children live with a family other than their birth family until they're able to be returned to their birth family, or are adopted, or are placed in a more permanent setting that best meets their needs. There's a real push, particularly by the courts, to eliminate the issue of drifting that we talked about earlier through care issues, and that is defined as children that are remaining in foster care for over 6 months. Group home care is an alternative to foster homes if a foster home is not available. And obviously, a group home is a home usually for an older child, an adolescent, where they live in sort of a congregate living facility with other foster youth. Residential treatment, typically reserved for children and adolescents who need intensive structure and residual services, usually related to mental health or substance abuse. And then kinship care. This is full-time parenting of children by kin. So again, this goes to the aunt, the uncle, some relative that's chosen to be able to step up and provide that level of substitute care. And the final stage for a child who has been determined to not be able to be returned to their family of origin is adoption. I think most folks are fairly familiar with adoption. This is where birth parents choose not to or cannot care for the child, and they're placed in this permanent home with parents who become their adoptive parents. Legal adoptions can only take place when the court terminates the parental rights of the birth parents. Um, Many adoptions today are made by step parents in the adoption of their stepchildren. And the most recent statistic I was able to identify is that in 2014, in the US, 415,129 children are living without permanent families in the foster care system. 101,666 of these children are eligible for adoption, but nearly 32% of these children will wait over 3 years in foster care before being adopted. And I think everybody's sort of heard the horror story of, children that when they reach a certain age, they maybe become less adoptable. There's been historical indications that children with developmental disabilities or physical disabilities may be more challenging in terms of being able to be successfully adopted. Um, it used to be that siblings often maybe were broken up and not adopted together. I think that's becoming less and less of an issue, and more likely that somebody who adopts a child will then also adopt their brothers and sisters as well. So lots of changes, lots of things going on in terms of adoption. And again, this goes into some of those. Children who are older, have physical or emotional disabilities, and who are members of sibling groups. There's efforts to try to improve the adoption capability of special needs children. They were once considered unadoptable. Um, Question we asked earlier in the lecture, is it important that a child be placed in a family who's ethnically or culturally the same? So if that is the case, if that is the priority, then adoption agencies need to be out recruiting more families of color, more single parents, others who have not considered adoption. That's always a big challenge, is just finding families that are interested in adoption. The whole concept of post-adoption services, so supportive services that come in and help the new family in terms of adapting to now having a child in their home. And then the whole concept of open adoptions, where the birth parents may still be part of their children's lives, even though they've been adopted by, another couple or another family. Um, and there have certainly been some situations where adoptions have not been successful, and they maybe have been returned either back to the birth parents or been placed in some kind of foster care system while they await, another placement. So we're going to pause here. We've got a few slides left, but I want to wrap those up in another video. So again, this is Modular 11, Services to Children, Youth, and Families, and this is video 3 of 4.